Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've got the main engine start. We have main engine start. 0. And we have liftoff.
When all has been written about this age of the 20th century, what will be its most significant event? It may well be the fact that ours was the time when humanity first escaped from the bounds of Earth. We have seen and witnessed what for centuries were but dreams. In less than a lifetime, the fantasies of science fiction have become fact.
Roger, 0J, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous.
We have sent mechanical voyagers to the planets and beyond. One has even left our solar system on an infinite journey through the stars. We have also witnessed the time when man first traveled and set foot on another celestial body.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This is the story of those first tentative steps. It is a story told by those who know it best, the ones who were there. From liftoff to touchdown, this series chronicles legendary moments of triumph and tragedy, frailty and strength, genius and courage. This is also a tale of political and international intrigue. Why was Russia almost always first in the early race for space? What were the reasons why America went to the moon? And for today and beyond, will space become a new battleground? This series attempts to answer these questions and more in a journey into the past and future. Spaceflight, the countdown has commenced.
Third inning, Bob Hazel on first, Johnny Logan facing Don Larson.
October 1957. In America, the country's attention is devoted to the national pastime. The Yankees and the Braves are tied at 1 game apiece in the World Series.
Matthews doubles into the right field corner, and here comes Hazel around to score.
But after October 4th, the world will never be the same again. On this day, Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, is launched into orbit. The event is called America's technological Pearl Harbor. For the United States, once peaceful evening skies suddenly seemed full of menace as the Russian Sputnik, visible to the naked eye, tracks across the heavens. Time Life journalist Hugh Sidey.
My life changed that night. It never came back to what it had been before, and I think this city's life changed that night. We had, despite the advances that we knew that Russians had made in military arms and in science, nevertheless understood we were going to be superior. There was in this city the attitude that we'd win. We'd do it better than them no matter what. And that night they beat us. And our technical excellence, which was everything really of this nation, was challenged.
Sputnik was the realization of dreams centuries old, dreams that first seemed possible at the dawn of the 20th century. From different parts of the globe, 3 very different men would almost simultaneously begin to reach for the stars. Long before the Wright brothers fly at Kitty Hawk, a mathematics schoolteacher from a small Russian village begins a solitary life of charting paths in space. His name, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. In 1883, he first argues that space travel is possible, despite the vacuum of space. The secret is the rocket. Tsiolkovsky's far-ranging visions include exploring the universe in space greenhouses, self-contained ecological starships. Before his death in 1935, he considers almost every major problem to be confronted by spaceflight. Today in Russia, FLlGHT is honored as the father of cosmonautics. Yet during his lifetime, few knew of him. His theories were rarely published outside Russia, and his contribution largely unknown. It is in America where theory is first put to practice. Inspired by the science fiction of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, young Robert Goddard dreams of traveling to distant planets, dreams that will become a lifelong passion. Like FLlGHT, he sees the answer to space travel is the rocket. As a young professor in 1919, Goddard publishes an article which includes a proposal that a rocket could be launched to the moon. This radical suggestion is ridiculed by the press, an event which has a powerful influence on Goddard throughout his life. The shy dreamer would never again seek public attention. But in 1926, Goddard assures his place in history. On a farm near Auburn, Massachusetts, he launches the world's first liquid-propelled rocket. It reaches an altitude of 184 feet. Flight duration, 2.5 seconds. From this modest beginning, Goddard's work attracts the interest of another flight pioneer, Charles Lindbergh. Intrigued by the possibilities of rocket flight, the famous aviator helps to find support for Goddard's experiments. With financial backing, Goddard moves to the open spaces of New Mexico. Here, with a handful of assistants, he continues testing in near seclusion. The rockets become larger, the results ever more impressive. In 1932, Goddard would write to H.G. Wells, "How many more years I shall be able to work on the problem, I do not know. I hope as long as I live. There can be no thought of finishing, for aiming at the stars is a problem to occupy generations. So no matter how much progress one makes, there is always the thrill of just beginning." Of his own choosing, Goddard's pioneering rocket experiments remain a solitary occupation. He shuns most inquiries concerning his work. Like FLlGHT in Russia, few in America would know of Goddard's achievements or appreciate the potential of the rocket. But in Germany, it is a different matter. Like aviation barnstorming in America, the rocket in post-World War I Germany becomes a popular and often spectacular sport. Instead of ridicule, physicist Hermann Oberth receives an enthusiastic response when he publishes his space travel theories in 1923. He is elected president of the German Society for Space Travel. It is the first of a number of small, financially struggling space groups. What they lack in money, these amateurs more than make up in enthusiasm. Unlike the shy Goddard, Oberth seeks out public attention for his rocket society. He agrees to build and launch a large rocket as a publicity stunt for the premiere of Fritz Lang's new science fiction film, Die Frau im Mond, The Girl in the Moon. The ambitious rocket is never built, but when the film is released in 1928, it has an enormous impact. With its stunning visions of the future, German interest in rocketry heightens even more. While most are intrigued with the romance of space travel, the German army sees another potential. Stifled by the arms restrictions of the Versailles Peace Treaty signed at the end of the First World War, the German military envisions a new weapon, the rocket as a form of long-range artillery. The officer placed in charge of Germany's military rocket program is Walter Dornberger. On a visit to observe the progress of some amateur rocket experiments, Dornberger meets an energetic young student. Impressed by his abilities, Dornberger offers him a civilian position in the Army's new missile program. His name, Wernher von Braun. Together with Dornberger, von Braun will change rocketry from an amateur sport into a devastating weapon that will forever change the strategy of war. Wernher von Braun recorded prior to his death in 1976.
The Ordnance Department didn't like our, what they called, circus-type approach, where we would invite people for an entrance fee to witness a rocket launch. And so they told us, in essence, what we really want is data. Get instrumentation, get data, and provide us with meaningful scientific material on how good these rocket engines really are.
For the Rocket Society members, financial support dwindles as the worldwide depression of the 30s worsens and Hitler's Nazi party rises to power. Rather than abandoning their dreams of space travel, many rocket amateurs join the ranks of Germany's military to continue their experiments. By the late 30s, the military rocket program outgrows its small urban facility, and construction begins on a secluded site off Germany's northern coast. It is named Peenemünde. There is no longer any worry over violating the Versailles Peace Treaty. Hitler has invaded Poland. World War II is underway. On a wartime footing, Peenemünde is instructed to build a weapon capable of carrying a 1-ton explosive warhead. Its dimensions are limited only by the need to transport the missile through Germany's railroad tunnels. But with Germany's early success in the war, a futuristic weapon is not a high priority. Dornberger and von Braun struggle not only for materials and money, but the talent to build the rocket. They persuade the German High Command to release some of its young scientists who have been assigned by Hitler to frontline duty. Already many have been lost. One who returns from the Russian front is Panzer Tank Captain Croft Erika.
We had, of course, many difficulties because almost everything was new. We tried to turn to industry for a number of things, such as liquid oxygen valve, very high performance centrifugal pumps. And very often the so-called experts in industry told us, you can't do that. The fact that you bring up those specifications show that you don't understand anything about building a valve for a cryogenic fluid like oxygen. Almost all elements were classical in a sense. The rocket motor, the aerodynamic body, the bullet shape, these sorts of things. But the one thing that was completely new was, of course, the guidance and control. It was not just the first large liquid propellant rocket, it was the first guided rocket, the first guided missile. And that, of course, caused problems too.
The first 2 tests of the rocket, called A4, come in the summer of 1942.
First was an absolute failure in that the A4 rose only a few feet and then toppled back and exploded. The second was a semi-success in that it flew successfully through the speed of sound and became the first guided missile really to penetrate the sound barrier, but it broke up later on.
The third attempt is on October 3rd. Croft Erika.
Those were the Wild West days of rocketry and space flight. You didn't have to be miles away. You could almost stand beside the rocket. And I was on the roof of one of those high-rises, actually looking down to the launch complex, to the launch place, just a few hundred meters distance. And came, of course, the countdown, the ignition, and then the system lifted off with a roar and lifted up straight. And of course, we all screamed with delight. It hadn't exploded on the launch complex. The guidance seemed to work. The thing went up straight, and it looked like a fiery sword going into the sky. And then came this enormous roar. The whole sky seemed to vibrate. This kind of unearthly roaring was something human ears had never heard. You know, it is very hard to describe what you feel when you stand on the threshold of a whole new era, of a whole new age that you know will become a new age. It's like those people must have felt, Columbus or Magellan, that for the first time saw entire new worlds and knew the world would never be the same after this had happened or after they had seen that. And this is the feeling many of us had, and in me it was very overwhelming. It was absolutely overwhelming. I almost fell off the roof. I was so excited. When we came down together, we congratulated ourselves. We knew the space age had begun, and Dr. Dornberger made a very moving speech at the time and said, well, this is the key to the universe. This is the first day of the space age.
A rocket, for the very first time, had reached the fringes of space. The space age had begun, not for adventure, exploration, or science, but as a weapon of war. Despite the first successful launch, there are many more failures which follow. It is a year later, in 1944, before Peenemünde is granted priority status. Hitler believes that this new wonder weapon can be the decisive turning point in the war, a war going badly for Germany. The rocket is renamed V-2, Vengeance Weapon Number 2. Its range, 200 miles. Maximum velocity, 3,500 miles per hour. Along with the slower airplane-like V-1, the V-2 is to be hurled upon Britain in retaliation against the massive Allied air bombardments that are destroying Germany's industrial base. The first V-2 is not launched against an Allied target until the fall of 1944, but it is with terrifying and deadly results. Unlike the slow and noisy gas engine of the V-1, the supersonic V-2 gives no warning. CBS television journalist Walter Cronkite.
Because I was covering the air war, that was my beat in London. The V-2, on the other hand, penetrated so deeply, coming in at almost a straight down angle and at great speed, penetrated so far that it got down into the basement of buildings before it exploded. And the explosion was all channeled upwards, so it'd just take a building right out of the middle of a row. But as I say, as a terror weapon, it was terrible. The V-1, the stories where we had 10 to 15 seconds to find shelter after we heard the engines quit in London. The V-2 you never heard at all if it was going to hit you. Once you heard the explosion of a V-2, you knew you were safe. But it was the precursor, certainly, of the missiles of the next war, heaven forbid. And as such, they are frightful weapons.
The misery of the V-2 is not limited to Allied targets. In Germany, SS troops gained control over the V-2's mass production. Using concentration camp victims and prisoners of war, it is believed that thousands perished in the slave conditions of the SS rocket factory.
The working conditions there were absolutely horrible. I saw the metal work several times, once while these prisoners were blasting new tunnels in there, and it was really a pretty hellish environment.
More may have died building the V-2 than would fall its victim as a weapon. For Hitler, it is too late for his vengeance weapon. Despite its terror, the V-2 will not change the outcome of the war.
In January 1945, the situation in Germany had deteriorated to the point that we could hear the Russian guns in the dim distance from Peenemünde. They had conquered most of eastern Pomerania, and it was just a question of time, maybe 2-3 weeks, that they would roll over Peenemünde.
Fearing capture by the Russians, Dornberger and von Braun direct a mass exodus of men and rockets to the south. They surrendered to the American Army in May of 1945.
In the midst of all this, I was also involved in an automobile accident and broke my left arm, so I was hospitalized. It was a pretty confusing situation.
As spoils of war, they are an astonishing bounty, their potential and worth unknown. Dornberger is arrested and tried for war crimes against England. After spending 2 years in prison, he is found innocent of all charges.
Out of all this developed Project Paperclip, under which 120 of us were invited to come to America and help evaluate the captured V-2 rockets that were taken to America.
Here, in the deserts of New Mexico, Robert Goddard had conducted his rocket research. Nearby, the first atomic bomb was detonated at Trinity Site. Now, using German rockets and German engineers, the United States enters the space age.
Now, our status at that time was that of, we were not officially prisoners of war, we were rather prisoners of peace. But one time we had bad luck, we had an accident. V2 arose from White Sands, and its guidance mode failed. It veered off towards the south. Now, fortunately, it was fast enough to arc over El Paso. I just shudder to think what would have happened if it had hit El Paso. And it hit Tijuana, and if memory serves, a cemetery in Tijuana. It impacted into a cemetery in Tijuana. We had already been called the only German task force that managed to invade United States territory and penetrate the United States as far westward as El Paso. Now we were known as the only German team that managed also to attack Mexico from their bases in the United States.
Von Braun's team launches more than 60 V-2s for the Americans. But for these men who still dream of space travel, the years in the New Mexico desert bring them no closer to their goal. Yet, in another western desert, the United States is moving closer to manned rocket travel than they could ever imagine. Today, it is called Edwards Air Force Base. Here, some of the world's best pilots roar through the skies. It is a place to test new ideas and new airplanes, a place to fly higher, fly faster than ever before. With its immense dry lake bed, Edwards is one of the world's largest landing fields for aircraft in trouble, an all too frequent occurrence in testing new airplanes. Located north of Los Angeles, California, in the Mojave Desert, Edwards, or Muroc, as it was called in earlier years, was once used as little more than a bombing range, complete with target battleships.
Edwards was...
Writer Tom Wolfe.
I always felt that the pilots themselves liked the fact that Edwards was such a godforsaken terrain. Edwards looks like something that evolution went through and forgot about. At Edwards, there's no vegetation except for tumbleweed, actually tumbleweeds blowing across the desert, and the Joshua trees, which are this strange arthritic form of plant life. The heat would reach 120 during the day and then drop to below freezing at night. Just an awful place to be, but the hard scrabble look of the place somehow appealed to these men, and they would live in tin shacks or in tents. The officers might get a shack, and enlisted men would be living in tents and freezing to death at night and sweltering all day. But somehow this was part of the magic of Edwards Air Force Base.
It was here that America's first jet was secretly tested, complete with a dummy propeller. Yet even after the end of World War II, a warlike urgency still remains at Edwards.
The United States had discovered right after in the last stages of the Second World War that the Germans had almost developed a rocket airplane that would go Mach 1. The British were trying very hard to develop a plane that would go Mach 1. And so this became the hottest race in military aviation, was to get a plane that would break the sound barrier. I mean, there are all sorts of advantages would flow from that if you could finally do it.
In the dogfights of World War II, American pilots had first encountered the violent buffeting of the sound barrier. Diving at high speeds, pilots found normally well-behaved airplanes suddenly flying out of control, and no one knew why. By the end of the war, the United States had amassed the largest fleet of airplanes in the world. With one single plane ride, they would all become obsolete. The plane to revolutionize aviation is a rocket called the X-1. Its sole purpose is to fly through the angry shock waves of the sound barrier. The X-1 is designed after the shape of a .50 caliber bullet with razor-thin wings. To save fuel, it is lifted aloft by a B-29 bomber, then dropped and powered by 4 liquid oxygen rockets. Once the fuel is depleted, the plane glides to a dead stick landing. Fires in the tail of the aircraft are commonplace. At high altitude, the canopy can ice over, leaving the pilot blind. There is no ejection seat. In a mid-air emergency, there is no escape from America's first manned rocket. The man chosen to break the sound barrier, Chuck Yeager.
I would say that about half of the engineers, aeronautical engineers, at that time in 1947, gave us no chance at all of ever successfully flying beyond the speed of sound. They said it's a so-called barrier and the airplane would, you know, go out of control or disintegrate. And but I didn't look at it that way. Jack Ridley, Captain Jack Ridley, who was a darn good test pilot and an excellent engineer, one of the best I've ever seen, and I would sit and talk literally for hours about what we would run into or what to expect in the X-1. And I had a lot of confidence in the airplane. I didn't figure that it would, you know, fly apart or swap ends without giving me some sort of a warning. And the X-1 especially was a lot of fun to fly because it was a rocket. You didn't have an engine out there roaring in front of you and a lot of shaking. And it was a natural to set in, and your knees were just about equal with your shoulders, so you could pull a lot of G's without blacking out. It didn't have a prop on it. It didn't have a jet engine. It was just strictly a rocket, and it was real slick to fly. The one reason that I was picked as the X-1, as General Boyd later in life said, was because of my maintenance background. I understood the system. Also, I could fly an airplane. And secondly, or thirdly, I was pretty well disciplined. I did basically what I was supposed to do. And although sometimes I stretched it a little bit, I pretty well stayed on the straight and narrow. But
just prior to his attempt at breaking the sound barrier, Yeager veers from the straight and narrow at a local establishment named after its proprietor, Poncho's.
She had a rodeo grounds, and she had a so-called nightclub, 20-room motel, an airport with a hangar and airplanes, and it's pretty. She also had a swimming pool. It was a real nice place to go because she had good steaks, and there was a good bar and a lot of fun. A lot of pilots hung out there a lot.
A few days before his attempt at breaking the sound barrier, Yeager goes horseback riding at this drinking hole and dude ranch for pilots and breaks 2 ribs. Knowing he'll be pulled from the flight if his injury is discovered, he turns to his friend Jack Ridley for help.
You know, I told him about busting a couple ribs, and he'd laugh and thought it was a big joke. And what I did, I got on the ladder, and he let the ladder down in the hangar itself, and I could get in the X-1 okay, and everything was really all right, except I couldn't get enough strength on my right arm. It would hurt so bad, I just couldn't close the door from the inside, and the handle stuck out about that 4. And Jack was looking through the canopy and watching me, and why I just couldn't close the door, he said, let's see what we can figure out. He went and got a piece of broomstick about that long that I could stick in the door handle and then close it with my left arm. And when I found that out, it was okay.
With one good arm and the help of a broomstick, Chuck Yeager is ready to make aviation history. As the Mach meter moves closer to the sound barrier, Yeager experiences the violent buffeting. Just before Mach 1, the plane smooths out, and for the first time, the skies hear the thunder of a sonic boom. but its echo will go no further than Edwards.
See, it wasn't classified when we broke Mach 1. So we talked openly about what we'd gotten a jump on the Mach meter and the buffeting smoothed out. But then after we landed and everybody was real happy there, and we notified Wright Field and the Flight Test Division and Bell Aircraft Company that we'd gotten the airplane up above Mach 1, then they came out and said classified.
For Yeager, there will be no national adulation. The triumph of the X-1, an event as significant as Lindbergh's crossing of the Atlantic, is smothered in Cold War secrecy. The X-1 is followed by an entire series of experimental aircraft and new pilots, all determined to go faster and higher than ever before. These would be called the good old days of Edwards, a time described as the Indianapolis of the air. After Mach 1, the next goal, twice the speed of sound. The man who would do it, flying the Navy's Douglas skyrocket, Scott Crossfield.
It occurred to us that our airplane maybe could go Mach 2. Dr. Dryden of the NACA reminded us that we don't make records. Our intent was research and development, and we were supposed to devote our efforts to that. But I was moved to suggest to the Navy that it would be an excellent idea if a Navy airplane could claim the first to Mach 2. Well, the Air Force people knew that we were doing that, but they didn't think that we could make it with that old airplane. So about 4 days before Yeager's next scheduled flight, we managed to make Mach 2 on a very cold and miserable morning by doing everything known to man that we could to get that airplane to go a little faster.
Pushing an airplane to the outer limits of its capabilities promises not only rewards, but dangers. After Crossfield's Mach 2 flight in the skyrocket, Yeager takes the X-1A up to Mach 2.3.
What happened, we got the X-1A going a lot faster than it was designed to go. And the airplane got into, we call it roll coupling, and the airplane just goes through wild rotational rates of rolling and pitching and yawing, all tied in together, and the tail was just too small on the X-1A, and as the same with the X-2.
In September 1956, test pilot Mel Apt prepares to make his very first powered flight in the X-2. He is given a flight plan that, if successful, will set yet another speed record of 2,100 miles per hour, 3 times the speed of sound. Flight engineers know from wind tunnel testing that at this high speed, the plane will probably experience some kind of instability. Breaks through Mach 3, but then deviates from the flight plan and begins to turn the X-2 back towards the dry lake. The aircraft goes unstable. This is the film of Apt's struggle to regain control. Mel Apt, the fastest man alive, for a few terrorizing moments. While test pilots compete for glory over the skies of Edwards, America's military services struggle for control of the rocket and the new high ground of space. For the American Army, the rocket is a super-range artillery piece. The Air Force sees in the rocket the means to fly higher and faster. The Navy envisions arming its vessels with sea-launched missiles. One ambitious military plan, called Project Bomby, envisions manned gliders swooping down from Earth orbit to deliver nuclear payloads on enemy targets. The enemy, of course, is anything red. It is the McCarthy era. The Russians have both the atomic and hydrogen bomb, and the Cold War is about to plunge again with the launching of the Russian Sputniks.
1957, year of space and Sputnik dogs. Laika, first space traveler, was ready for the takeoff, and here it is. At 600 miles, the half-ton satellite joined the meteors in outer space to orbit around the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour with its passenger. In the shadow of the Eiffel Tower and Sputnik, President Eisenhower, French Prime Minister Gaillard, and other NATO leaders gathered in Paris to consider the peril. In the rocket's fiery wake was America's sober realization that the battle had just been joined and that the work of self-preservation was at hand. In 1958, the dawn of the space age.
Political scientist and longtime observer of America's space program, John Logsdon.
There was an almost automatic assumption of U.S. superiority in the world, and to have some other country, especially a country that we thought was our enemy, demonstrate something like this really surprised, and since we didn't understand what it meant, scared the person in the street. It scared the leadership of the country in a different way, because it was a demonstration of lifting capability. If you could put a satellite in orbit, and particularly Sputnik 2, which contained a dog, Laika, and was really a heavy piece of hardware. If you could put that large a piece of hardware in orbit, you could clearly put a warhead on an American city from the Soviet Union.
2 months after the launching of Sputnik, America prepares its answer as the world watches the countdown of Project Vanguard. At the end of World War II, America, with its nuclear monopoly, had seemed invincible. Now the Soviet Union was clearly ahead in rocket technology. America's fate could be decided by another country on the other side of the world in half an hour.
President Eisenhower reassures the nation that Russia's success with the first satellite does not indicate a serious lag in American rocket research.
Vanguard, for the reasons indicated, has not had equal priority with that accorded our ballistic missile work. Speed of progress in the satellite project cannot be taken as an index of our progress in ballistic missile work. Our satellite program has never been conducted as a race with other nations. Rather, it has been carefully scheduled as part of the scientific work of the International Geophysical Year.
The United States was a couple of years behind, both in the development of a hydrogen weapon and in the development of our rockets, and because of a breakthrough that Edward Teller worked on in the early 50s, we were able to develop a rather lighter warhead, and therefore didn't need as big a missile. What they were trying to do was develop an intercontinental missile capability to launch a hydrogen warhead from the Soviet territory to the United States. And at the time they froze their missile design, the warhead was very heavy, and so they needed a big booster. The Soviets had a big rocket at a time when we had a small one. And a lot of the weightlifting disparity in those first 3 or 4 years was because of that early difference.
The Russians had blindsided the world with their unexpected display of rocket technology. But how had it happened? Knowledge of Russia's early rocket development has trickled to the West year by year. Like Germany, amateur space enthusiasts in Russia formed rocket societies in the 20s and 30s. Also like Germany, these amateurs were absorbed into the military. This is the Soviet Union's first liquid rocket, launched in November of 1933. Only one person in this photograph has ever been positively identified, Sergei Korolyov. More than any other single person, he will be responsible for the creation of Russia's space program. Soviet space observer Jim Oberg.
And Sergei Korolev was the chief designer, the chief organizer, and the chief political force behind their space program. It was he who built the system, and then it was he who persuaded Nikita Khrushchev to finance space shots. In fact, he suggested that several of these military missiles be diverted into space flights, such as Sputnik. It was his idea, it was his manipulations, it was his accomplishment, and the rest is history. Khrushchev demanded that all the publicity for the space shots come to Khrushchev. Korolev was never, his name was never mentioned in connection with the space program. Only after his death was the fact that he even existed acknowledged in the Soviet press. This makes Soviet space history very hard to reconstruct, from my point of view, because once Korolev had died and became a public figure, Khrushchev, the man who had stolen his glory, had become an unperson. And the Soviet history could not mention Khrushchev by name. So that you have two phases. One, Korolev doesn't exist and Khrushchev does. The second phase, which we're still in now, Korolev did exist and is a great man, but Khrushchev, who was he?
After the humiliation of Vanguard, America turns to Wernher von Braun to launch its first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. Journalist Hugh Sidey.
I remember I was down at the Cape for the launch by Wernher von Braun of the Redstone rocket that finally got our satellite in orbit. And I remember being down before that happened with some British journalists, and we stood on the beach of Cocoa Beach along Florida's coast as we were waiting for another abortive attempt to put a satellite up, and we could see Sputnik. We could see it, we could trace it with the naked eye in those clear nights. And I remember this British fellow said, here we are down here and there, the Russians are up, and Sputnik traces this lovely trail across the heavens while your rockets remain rooted to their paths like oak trees. And I thought, oh boy, you know, that's bad.
With the intense public reaction to Sputnik, President Eisenhower is compelled to create a new space program. But who should control it?
Even though he had come out of a career military background, he was skeptical of the military, felt that they should be under the control of civilian authorities, and was not willing, except for specific missions, to give this new unknown technology to the military. There was moderate controversy. The military services lobbied very hard, but they were divided among themselves, and it was not too difficult to bring into creation NASA as a civilian agency.
In 1958, Congress approves Eisenhower's new space agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA's first major mission, to put a man into space. The plan is derived from an Air Force project titled Project MISS, or Man in Space Soonest. The logical engineering advances made by the rocket planes at Edwards are tossed aside in favor of a quicker human cannonball approach. Project Mercury calls for a passenger to be hurled into space atop a ballistic missile. Landing will be by parachute at sea. Search parties made up of a fleet of American naval vessels will be necessary to retrieve the capsule and its passenger. Eisenhower makes one more crucial decision that will forever affect America's space program. The volunteers are all to be military test pilots. But most of them have already cast a wary eye on this man-in-the-can approach to flying.
And I read about the space program, the Mercury, but like I say, it wasn't flying to me, so I wasn't interested in it.
And so the topic of conversation was really, how would this affect your career in the Navy?
I'd been at Edwards about 4 years at that point. The normal tour is supposed to be 3, and I could see their handwriting on the wall. It was inevitable I was going to have to go somewhere.
But then, of course, they were talking about putting a man on top of a Atlas booster, and these boosters were blowing up every other time down at the Cape. So it was a little bit apprehensive as to whether this would be a good program. I remember distinctly that Schra was not very much for that program.
I had no reason at all to get involved with this thing. Then they started telling us about how we would probably be successors to chimpanzees, and I said, no way.
Despite the misgivings, 56 pilots volunteer for additional testing. For these men, it is an unbelievable array of medical, physical, and psychological probings.
They were certainly effective hotshot pilots based on their records, based in many cases on combat record.
Robert Vose, one of the psychologists responsible for selecting America's first astronauts.
The ones that were selected, I think, one of the important factors was how well they got along with people, how motivated they seemed in the system. One thing that seemed to be important as they went through all these tests and they did all these things, some of them annoying, was how well they were able to react to it and how well they were able to react to people.
And then we went off to Wright-Patterson, and that's when I decided they really were grasping at straws, and particularly in the psychological and the head shrinkers that they dragged out. I don't think these guys knew a stick from a rudder or space from a submarine, and they were running around grasping at straws, and I began to play even more games with them. So that end result was that I was not one of the chosen.
I had been involved in selecting aviators, and I knew something about how one went about that and the qualities that were necessary. But the first question that occurred to me was, this was so new, and I suppose I was a little young and in awe on the whole project, but it seemed to me that quite aside from being the pilots and making sure that they could operate this spacecraft, that these individuals were likely to become famous. They were likely to be the new Lindberghs, the new Columbus.
On April 9th, 1959, NASA presents to the world its 7 Mercury astronauts. Navy Lieutenant Commander Scott Carpenter, Air Force Captain Gordon Cooper, Marine Lieutenant Colonel John Glenn, Air Force Captain Virgil Gus Grissom, Navy Lieutenant Commander Wally Schirra, Navy Lieutenant Commander Alan Shepard, and Air Force Captain Deke Slayton. To America, these 7 young men are more than astronauts. They are a nation's hope to restore its technological self-esteem.
We weren't sure what we were at that point. We felt like we were a bunch of monkeys in a zoo. We were all basically test pilots. We were interested in the technical part of the thing, but on the other hand, we recognized there was a element here that we had to be prepared to cope with.
Responding to the avalanche of media and public fascination, NASA puts the astronauts' personal stories on the bidding block. The starting price, $500,000. The terms, all stories must be submitted and approved by NASA in advance. The only bidder is Life magazine. Alan Shepard.
The first suggestion was, well, just lock them up. Don't let them talk to anybody. And of course that, from a practical standpoint, would not have been good for the training process. From our standpoint, being basically prisoners wouldn't have been, it's not a good way to live and to develop and to train. But NASA needed a good image of the individuals. I mean, the fact that I was being portrayed as something perhaps that I wasn't, that didn't really bother me that much.
Hugh Sidey.
Oh, I didn't feel that bad about it. Checkbook journalism has been with us as long as we've had journalism and still is. I mean, the big and the powerful get the breaks, that's all, and this happened to be the case. We were a little more imaginative, a little more aggressive, and we had a little more money, and that doesn't change.
Walter Cronkite.
Well, I think at the time, those of us who were sort of intimately connected with the program as correspondents and news people around the Cape, Cocoa Beach, were quite aware that the image that NASA was trying to project was not quite honest, but at the same time, there was a recognition that the nation needed new heroes.
With the help of NASA and Life magazine, the Mercury astronauts quickly become heroes, flying saints of space, even before the first of them flies. Former astronaut and test pilot Mike Collins.
Test pilots at Edwards every day were putting airplanes through their paces, and in some cases it was quite hazardous work, and to them it was thrilling and exciting, and they couldn't understand why the public paid no attention to them whatsoever. But you could put a guy or a monkey or something in this little can and shoot him off, and Lord, it was front page news. I think that rankled a little bit.
Chuck Yeager.
The one thing that I didn't necessarily agree with was that, like all of the original first 7 astronauts, were military test pilots, and they were trained as I was, basically. And military pilots, the way I look at it, you do something because it's your job. And when the Time Life contract NASA entered into and exposed the guys to a mercenary environment of taking a lot of pay for doing their job, that to me was wrong.
Former Apollo astronaut Rusty Schweikert.
Historically, that's going to be an interesting balancing act for the lady with the scales. You know, was that space for privacy on the part of the astronauts worth the price that we all paid for this kind of Boy Scout, monotone image of what we were?
Meanwhile at Edwards, the skies reverberate to the sounds of new and faster flying machines. The rocket-powered X-15 flies at speeds 4, 5, and 6 times the speed of sound. taking test pilots to the very edge of space. Tom Wolfe.
All of these aircraft, including the X-15, despite the computerization of controls that eventually were put into the X-15, were planes that had to be flown by an individual, and that required the skill as well as the courage of an individual pilot. Unlike anything that ever was flown in a space program, in which the individual's control of a spaceship in Mercury and Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, or for that matter, the shuttle, was very limited. In some cases, didn't exist at all. But in these rocket ships, it was always required.
The X-15's first pilot, Scott Crossfield.
It was really a combination airplane and spacecraft because it had the capability of going well out of the sensible Earth's atmosphere. And I always thought that it was the best flying of the research airplanes because the pilot helped design it. And actually it was. It was a very good flying airplane. It wasn't easy to fly, but it was an honest airplane, very honest airplane. I'd hit the flight line about 5 in the morning and start suiting up in the full pressure suit that was designed for the X-15 and board the airplane perhaps somewhere around 6:30 or 7 o'clock after I took the flight surgeon's temperature to see if he was going to survive. We also had some very strong rules that if there was difficulties with either airplane, there was 1 man in the X-15, there were 5 in the B-52, so we would save the B-52 and throw away the X-15. Immediately upon launch, you light the rocket engines, and if they lit off all right, we went and did what was in the flight plan, or as much as we could. Things happened so fast that this was all committed to memory.
Right on, you look real good. Okay, fine. And uphill at 33,000 feet.
We had some difficulties with the program. We had 1 airborne explosion, several small airborne fires. I broke the airplane in 2 once, landing it on Rosamond, and it blew up one time on the pad while we were running a ground engine test.
Throttle off.
Those were just rocks in their chutes.
The X-15 is without question the most successful research airplane that has ever flown.
Launch. Turning off to the right side. Launch, the tank pressure is going up to 60. Back in the saddle.
The Black Rocket flies for nearly a decade, making 199 flights. Among its pilots is a civilian named Neil Armstrong. In 1969, he will be the first man to set foot on the moon, launched atop a rocket built by Wernher von Braun and the core of his Peenemünde team. Chuck Yeager will also leave his mark on America's space program. In 1962, he becomes the first commander of the Air Force Aerospace Pilot School. The X-1 pilot, who had once disdained the space program for its lack of piloting skills, would train many of NASA's future astronauts.
You know, we're turning out an entirely different breed of pilot here at the school. These guys will be working on programs all the way from the surface of the Earth to space. In fact, they'll probably be flying vehicles that are unheard of today.
On glide slope. Approaching center line. Looking great.
Over 3 decades after the breaking of the sound barrier, the skies over Edwards echo with a different kind of sonic boom. One from a rocket plane gliding back to Earth from outer space.
40, 30, 20, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, touchdown.